And before we get started, I want to take a moment to acknowledge that wherever you are calling in from, whether it's Capitol Hill or our folks in Kentucky or Denver or New Mexico, you are on Indigenous land. And if you're here in the Seattle area, you are on the historic and contemporary lands and waters of the Duwamish, Suquamish, Muckleshoot, and all Coast Salish people. People who were forcefully removed, but whose endurance we honor with deep respect and gratitude for their stewardship of this place. To this day, the Duwamish people have yet to receive federal recognition. We encourage you to visit the Duwamish Longhouse in West Seattle to learn more. Tonight, we're going to be learning about the history of 36 Aboriginal women from Canada and Native women from tribes in Washington and Alaska who migrated to Bainbridge Island, the traditional territory of the Suquamish people in the early 1940s. And with that, I'm going to start the film, Honor Thy Mother, and then please stay afterward for a live Q&A. Thank you. That was really moving. And now to do a question and answer about this film, I'd like to introduce both Lucy Ostrander and Gina Corpuz. And Lucy is an independent documentary filmmaker whose work has focused on Pacific Northwest history and Pacific Rim cultures. With an emphasis on social justice, her award-winning documentaries have screened at film festivals around the country and have been broadcast both nationally and on PBS and internationally. Gina is the daughter of Evelyn Williams, Suquamish Nation, and Anacelto Corpuz from the Philippines. She grew up on Bainbridge Island, Washington. Gina completed her BA in Ethnic Studies at Antioch, Seattle, and her master's in education at UW. She's the executive producer of Honor Thy Mother. Thank you both so much for joining us today. I'll let you each introduce yourselves.
Hi, I'm Lucy Ostrander. I'm producer director.
Hothkakwal and MOHAI, thank you for sharing our film, and I'm honored to be here.
Thank you. Could you tell us a little bit more about how this film came about?
I had made a film back in, I think, 2007 about the Filipino-American community on Bainbridge Island. And Gina was one of the people that we interviewed for the film. And in the summer of 2019, Gina contacted me. She had a small grant and wanted to do some oral histories of the Indipino community with the idea of perhaps eventually making a film. And so that's how it started.
Yes, I would like to, first of all, say that I love having the interpreters and watching their description and their interpretation of the words being spoken, because it's highly emotional. And I see the film actually in a more enhanced way. And so I would like to say that I am of mixed heritage. I'm Asian and Indigenous, meaning that I'm Filipino and Squamish. I'm 70 years old. I've given up hair color, and so now I'm letting my hair go white. And I'm sitting in my dining room in front of my antique buffet with some books behind me. And I'm wearing a red scarf that has some flowers on it that's turquoise and yellow. And I call it my Zoom scarf.
What makes it the Zoom scarf?
because I wear it for all the Zoom meetings. And one time I wasn't feeling well, so I put the scarf over my pajamas. And one of the people in the audience said, "Gina, are you wearing pajamas under that scarf?" So that's what's nice about Zoom, is you can sometimes stay in your cozy clothes.
True.
And we've done so many Zoom meetings now, for communities, for museums, for civic organizations, for the Rotary Club, as well as being invited to share the film in classrooms at both the University of Washington and the University of British Columbia, Goddard College, and other higher education organizations.
What's the reception been like? I feel like this is a part of history that is so little understood. You know, if people know the history of Bainbridge, often they know about the Japanese evacuation and incarceration, but I don't think I've ever heard about this part of the story. What sorts of reactions have you been getting to this uncovering of history and deepening of the story of Bainbridge?
The reaction has mainly been one of surprise and disappointment that this film and the curriculum and the history wasn't included in their K-12 education, and especially on Bainbridge Island, where the history is about the Indepino community of Bainbridge Island. And many people who grew up here and or moved here 30 years ago were just disappointed that this didn't happen sooner. And many people have asked us, why didn't you share this story sooner? And so it's easy to become defensive with a question like that. However, we are a community that really had to evolve and recognize our mixed heritage and take time to construct our own Indigenous identity, because we grew up basically in the Filipino culture as Asians.
Is there a part of the story that you would like to share that didn't make it into the documentary, or Lucy, that as part of the editing process you feel it wasn't able to make in, but is something that you think needs to be told?
One of our ideas in making the film was to go up to British Columbia and do some filming up there. But because of COVID, we weren't able to do this. We did the interviews in the fall of 2019, and then COVID hit in March of 2020. And so we had to work with the material of the interviews we had. We didn't even want to do any additional interviews just because of COVID. And and finding archival material. So, fortunately, I was able to do a lot of that without having to travel. So.
Mm-hmm. And just to add to the colonization of Indigenous peoples and some of the stories and atrocities and trauma that Indigenous people have suffered through in North America and Aboriginal people in other parts of the world. In North America, of course, we are an invaded people. And the invasion broke our world apart. We lost our way of governing ourselves, our way of communicating, our modes of transportation. We were no longer able to build cedar canoes, sing our songs, make our drums, and also lost our way of sustaining ourselves. In the United States, which maybe of course, a little bit different from Canada. Many tribal people were dislocated or relocated off of their traditional territory, and with promises to have work if they moved to the cities, if they moved to an urban environment. And oftentimes there was no work to be done. And many of those who relocated became homeless and street people. And now there's generations of Indigenous people who live on the streets.
It feels like there's so much trauma to heal from
Mhm.
that it can seem overwhelming at times. What do you see as the path forward for healing from this ancestral harm and making a way forward as a community?
There's a lot of reclaiming our land and reclaiming our Indigenous way of life, and revitalizing our songs, our dances, our traditional wear, revitalizing our spiritual practices. When Indigenous people were basically outlawed for being Indigenous, they were stripped of everything. And children were removed. And when you take away children and isolate them in boarding schools, that severs the tie through which culture is transmitted. And so that's why they call it multi-generational trauma and historical trauma, is that it doesn't just end with our mothers who were in Indian residential schools. There was no culture, traditions, language passed on to us. And in addition to that, when our mothers married our Filipino fathers, and this is very strategic, it's a very strategic governmental way of reducing the number of Indigenous people who live on this earth. And it happens all over the world. So when my mother married my father, who's a Filipino immigrant, she was disenfranchised from her tribe. She was one of hundreds of thousands of Indigenous people who could no longer call themselves Squamish, Sechelt, Duncan, Nooksack. They were basically disenfranchised from their tribes. They could only go back to their traditional territory to visit their relatives, but they could not participate in any of their spiritual or cultural practices. That was very strategic. And it was a gender-based, legislated, discriminatory act that was only enacted against women, Indigenous women. If an Indigenous man married a white woman, he was not disenfranchised. His white wife became a member of our nation and was able to access all the benefits of being a tribal member: health benefits, education, housing, whereas our mother couldn't even access those benefits until 1985, when they reversed that legislation and our mothers were able to reinstate themselves as Squamish Nation members. But by that time, many of our mothers had already passed away. And fortunately, the reenactment of the Indigenous women who had been disenfranchised was passed on to their children and their grandchildren. So myself and all my sisters and my son are now official voting members of my mother's nation, the Squamish Nation.
I'm glad that there was change that came, even if it was too late for the older generation to get to see it. That's horrible. And as you said, seems very clearly structurally done in a way to silence people and make sure that they don't have power within their culture and are divorced from their culture. So we have a number of questions from our listeners, and one of them, a basic one, is how large is the Indepino community?
Well, there were over 65 Filipino immigrant men who worked on Bainbridge at one time or another in agriculture. And of those 65 men, 36 of them married Indigenous women. And those Indigenous women came from 19 different tribes, mostly Canada, but there were some women from the Nooksack, Lummi, Yakima, and Tlingit nations in the United States. So out of those 36 marriages, 150 children were born. And so there was quite a large Indipino community at one time. But with the Indipino generation, basically farming ended because the work was too hard. We didn't want to grow up in poverty. We didn't want to be farmers. We went to college. We wanted careers, and we were willing to move off of the island to make sure that our children lived a better life, not in poverty, the way that we did.
That makes sense. Are there specific cultural or artistic practices specific to the Indipino community?
Artistic practices?
Or, yeah, cultural practices that are both drawing from both the Indigenous community and Filipino community, but that are different than either of your mother or your father's community, that's become something new.
Yes, and it's not an easy thing to do. And people who are watching this who are also of mixed heritage, usually one culture dominates the other. So in our way of life, we were raised as Filipinos, and our mothers were not allowed to speak their language. They didn't do any of their traditional dances, no drumming, and mostly no Indigenous foods. So everything for us was Filipino. But as we evolved, we have now formed the Indipino community of Bainbridge Island. And a lot of people have asked us, what's the difference between the Indipino community of Bainbridge Island and the Filipino-American community of Bainbridge Island? And my father was one of the founders of the Filipino-American community of Bainbridge Island in 1943. And so it's been around a long time. And they were the first berry farmers in the state of Washington to actually form a growers association. And then they saved all their money and they bought a community hall on 10 acres. So that is our monument, basically. That's our marker for our fathers. And almost everybody on Bainbridge knows about the Filipino Hall, but nobody knew about our mothers because we were forced to just be quiet about it. But now that we have the Indipino community, we started in the early 90s. We started with an island powwow, which isn't traditionally Coast Salish, but we had an island powwow, and it was called the Honor Thy Mother Powwow. So we have been at this for 30 years, and There was dancing and drumming and traditional foods. And what we've come to realize 30 years later is that activities and events are just not sustainable. They're not sustainable because people come and go and it's a lot of work. And it just makes sense to create a text that's accessible and will be accessible and available to learners and teachers all the time. And this film will never go obsolete, mainly because it's an oral history. And I know that some people might want to argue and say, there was no discrimination on Bainbridge. There was no such thing as prejudice. But feelings don't lie.
Have you had that? Have you had people push back and say that there wasn't discrimination?
Yes,
Really?
not very many people. We have a lot of support. We have a lot of support, not just on Bainbridge Island, but throughout the county. And the Bainbridge Island School District actually has used our film for professional development for all the teachers in the entire school district. The school board is looking at adopting our curriculum that goes with the film as 8th grade curriculum. We also have done professional development for the North Kitsap School District. So it's pretty far reaching, and film is really just a good way. I know Lucy can speak to this. It's really a good way to transform an audience. And especially one that's as emotional as this. People want to know more, and they want to know how they can help.
I would love to hear your thoughts too, Lucy, on the power of documentaries to change people's opinion.
Yeah, I mean, film is a very powerful medium, and I think I grew up wanting to, in a very political environment, grew up in the 60s, and wanted to use art form, some sort of art form to help illustrate my ideas. And I first started doing radio documentaries, and then realized that film was just a very powerful medium. So I studied film and combined my political ideas, and that's how it started. So.
Thank you. We've got some people asking about resources for learning more. One question was if there was a display at the Bainbridge Island Museum about the Indipino community, or if there's any plans for that. And then also a question for general resources, which makes me wonder, is there a way for folks who want to learn more to access the curriculum that you have mentioned?
Yes, actually, the Indepino community of Bainbridge Island, which is a nonprofit, has a website, and you can access it by going to Indepino community of Bainbridge Island.org. And within that website is the history of the Indipinos of Bainbridge Island. So anyone who needs to know more or needs to write a paper, students or teachers who want to teach more about the Indipino community can access the history through our website. And also, I am working with the Bainbridge Island Museum currently and developing an exhibit there are 13 new exhibits going into the Bainbridge Island Museum. So basically they've gutted the museum, and they're developing 13 new exhibits. And one exhibit is of the Indipino community. One is of the Filipino-American community, the Suquamish tribe, the Japanese American community, and then other exhibits. And so we've been working on this for months now, and the grand opening will be May 6th.
Great. I'll have to go check it out. And for all of our viewers who are in the vicinity, highly recommend. Another question for you, Gina. Is there an activity or experience that makes you feel connected to your mother and her culture, especially?
Yes, actually. I mentioned that when I started to construct my own identity, not just as an Indigenous person or a Native person, but as a Squamish person, which is my mother's tribal affiliation. And there's an interesting thing, and that's very painful too. I know a lot of tribal people, if you're not a member of your tribe, you don't feel like you belong. There's no sense of belonging. So you feel excluded from your tribe, from Asians, from white society. So basically, you're an outsider in all of these communities. And that's not a good place to be, but it has been proven that that is one of the main reasons that Indigenous students drop out of school. No sense of belonging anywhere. So in the late 90s, after I graduated from the University of Washington, I moved to British Columbia and lived with my people. And I was the associate director of education. And what I told my staff was that I had more to learn from them than they had to learn from me, because I don't believe that there's only one type of knowledge. The hierarchy of knowledge is always academic knowledge. So if you have a bachelor's degree, great. If you have a master's degree, that's even better. If you're a PhD, that's fantastic. But I believe that equally as important is cultural knowledge, who you are, where you come from, and not only learn about it, but practice it. Traditional knowledge, and traditional knowledge also includes our spiritual practices. And it's not something that we normally share with everyone, because many of our spiritual practices are private and are not open to the public. And that's what happened when corporations started taking away our land, is that we were banned from a lot of our sacred places, our streams and our rivers and our mountains, and how we harvested berries, our walk through the woods to get our medicine. So basically, colonization made sure that every part of us was destroyed, and it's been taking decades and decades to reclaim and revitalize. And so our community, the Indipino community, many of us have embraced our mixed heritage by wearing a traditional ribbon skirt. And so that's our Indigenous part. And then the top part of our regalia is the traditional Filipino kimono that we wear on the top. And then we might also wear a cedar hat. And it's just becoming, I wouldn't say exactly the norm, but people are fascinated by it.
That's wonderful to make something your own and to be able to take elements of both cultures and weave it together in that way.
We even choreographed our own dance.
Really?
We did. It was a lot of fun.
I bet.
And so there's really more to come.
Yeah, it seems like this is just like a blossoming in the last 30 years of culture and reclamation. We have time for just a couple more questions. So if you're in the audience and you have a question that you have wanted to ask but hasn't had a chance to type it out yet, now is your chance. One question we have is asking, what messages would you emphasize to the 4th and 5th generations about preserving their Indigenous heritage?
Well, we're all land-based people. Our land is how we practice our traditions and our culture. And so the part that I would emphasize to all Indigenous people is go to your mother or father's traditional territory and learn, because it's very, very different. It's very different from living on Bainbridge Island. If you go to your traditional territory, there is so much to learn about who you are as a person, and the pride and the spiritual practices and the traditional foods and our sacred places and our language. We are already, I would say, 3 or 4 generations into revitalizing our original language.
That's exciting. I know that's so hard to keep languages going when there's so much stacked against it, and so
Well,
much, like you were saying, with in the boarding schools, of forced erasure.
right, and language is not just talking to other people about what you did today or where you're going to go on vacation. The original language is actually spoken with concepts and imagery, and it tells really the history of our way of life, how we sustained ourselves, how we traveled, and how we treated one another with respect.
Yeah. And so it contains so many lessons in it. Before we close, do you have, either of you have any last things that you want to leave our audience with? Any words of wisdom or ways that people can help spread this information and teach others, or calls to action that you would like them to know?
Go ahead, Lucy.
I don't have anything to say. If people are interested in, we sell the DVD from our website if people are interested in purchasing it. Stourwater.com.
So a lot of people, well, for instance, we screened the film with a magazine out of San Francisco, Positively Filipino. And it was the first time it had ever been screened by a Filipino organization. And their perspective was totally different than just a mainstream audience, because their thought process was that we are the immigrants and we migrated to the Americas, where the original people are the indigenous people. So Filipinos should have acculturated into the indigenous ways, but it never happened. It never happened. Filipinos never acculturated into the indigenous ways.
Yeah.
But like Lucy said, that the other thing they asked was, why are we just focusing on our mothers? Why are you just talking about being Aboriginal? And what they didn't know is that Starwater Pictures had already produced a historical film about the Filipino immigrants of Bainbridge Island. And I think it came out maybe 10 or 15 years ago. And so,
yeah, it's called Island Roots.
and both these films are really, they have so many themes running through them and so much historical information, and that they both make really great classroom, a classroom resource. They're a great text for classrooms, and young people are very, very interested in having a dialogue.
Yeah. So I guess for those of you watching, if you are a teacher, if you know a teacher, this is something to ask for to be included in curriculum.
And there is curriculum for Island Roots, that's on our website. So.
That's wonderful.
So
Thank
the other thing we have is, just real quickly,
Oh,
is
yeah.
we also have an Indipino historical exhibit, and it's a traveling exhibit. It's 8 panels that just fold down and you can carry it into a classroom. And we've had it several places now, and it's really fantastic if the film can be screened, if it's ever screened in person again. If the school could bring the exhibit into their library or even into the classrooms, so students have time, students and teachers have time to, before they view the film, that they have a context, they have a historical context before they actually view the film, because it just really builds a deeper understanding.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you both so much, Lucy and Gina. I'm so happy to have you here today.
Thank you.
I feel like
Thank
I
you for
learned so
inviting us.
much. Yes,
Thank
and
you to the interpreters.
yes, thank you to all of our interpreters, both our ASL interpreters and our captioner tonight. We're so happy to have you. And thank you to HistoryLink, our partner on the History Cafe series. So for those of you in the audience, we would love if you'd take a moment to answer just a few questions about the program so that we can bring you the best in regional history programs in the future. It will only take about 5 minutes, and there is a chance to enter for a raffle prize. So we'll put the link in the chat. And then please join us for our next History Cafe, which is going to be in a month on March 16th. And that's going to be with Dr. Charlotte Cote talking about exploring Indigenous food sovereignty. And always, if you learn something new or enjoy the work we do, please consider making a gift or becoming a member to support future programs and help sustain the museum beyond the impact of the pandemic closure. Thank you so much. We're so happy to have you here, and please have a lovely rest of your evening and stay safe, stay healthy, and we look forward to seeing you in person. Have a great night.